Today on Biblical Higher Ed Talk, I sit down with Todd Williams, president of Cairn University and ABHE board member, to talk about his experiences testifying before President Trump's Religious Liberty Commission. And we also talk about the importance of how religious liberty in the United States actually establishes a key foundation for a flourishing culture. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm your host, Philip Dearborn, president of the Association for Biblical Higher Education. And my guest this week is Todd Williams. I actually had Todd on in like episode, I think it was 4 or 5 of the podcast, and we're approaching episode 100. I don't want anybody to compare the two episodes. Todd, you were fantastic. I was a nervous wreck, but I kind of know what I'm doing now with this. But Todd is president of Cairn University and also an ABHE board member. In fact, we've been together the last couple of days at a board meeting. And before that, Todd, you had the opportunity to testify before President Trump's Religious Liberty Commission. And you had texted me, said, hey, we're headed in. We prayed for you. And it was just fascinating hearing your experience. And I thought what we would do is invite you in to kind of talk about the topic of religious liberty, sure. But then also about your experiences. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, no, glad to be here. Really enjoy the podcast. Think it's very important, and I hope that this conversation is helpful. I think it's a very timely topic for us to get into.
It is, and that's a great lead into the first question because I've been a professional in Christian higher education pretty much all my professional career, 30 plus years. So have you. You've been in K-12 Christian education as well, and I probably all of those years there's always been some mention of or some concern that we talk about religious liberty, and is our religious liberty being threatened? And obviously there's politics that's involved with that, and that ebbs and flows. But what I've discovered is a lot of people don't really know the fuller context of what even is religious liberty, and why is it a core foundation here in the United States for the establishment really of a flourishing culture? Is it something that has only been around for 40 years, or is there more of a context to it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that, there is a lot of talk because of the political and legal issues, whether in higher education we're concerned about Pell Grants and federal funding, and we hear the Title IV threats and what's going to happen in terms of scholarships, and are we going to get discriminated against as faith-based institutions by the government? Mm-hmm. And in the K-12 world, similar kinds of things, and then accrediting bodies. And there's always a lot of talk around this subject in our sector. In fact, you do a great job of bringing in experts from ADF and others to talk to us about what's going on with religious liberty. My experience is, and I think over the last several years, in terms of my own teaching and work and trying to help on this issue as well, is that a lot of times we get into those things and we're talking about specifics of a case. So someone will mention such and such via the government or Department of Education, and everybody starts to they fall into this, well, I'll fake it till I make it. They're talking about religious liberty, and I nod. It's a threat to me as a Christian organization, a ministry, a college, a school, whatever it might be. And we then start thinking about religious liberty then as a political issue or a policy issue. And I think that what we need to do is step back and have a little bit of a primer on what exactly is religious liberty. It is not a political position. It is not a policy issue. It's a founding principle. Mm-hmm. It's baked in the cake at the founding of the constitutional republic that these individuals who framed this unique form of government made it a priority to protect religious liberty. So many of them came from the old world to start a new world with that in view, mm-hmm. to live. I mean, the separatists came to live free from religious persecution, as did the Quakers and Anabaptists and others. And the Puritans came actually to set up a society that would be more just and virtuous, informed by its Christian faith, as an example to the old world. So you have this sort of long-standing relationship between religion and faith and the American experiment, as people refer to it. But I think the danger is to think of religious liberty either as a policy issue that people, because then what we start doing is saying, well, then on religious liberty, as soon as we're outnumbered, the politics will change, the policy will change. And I think we have to make a much stronger case that what we're talking about here is a founding principle. The founders and framers believed that what was necessary for a flourishing society is the free expression of religion. The Constitution prohibits the government from establishing any religion, which is where everybody talks about separation of church and state, which is a whole other ball of wax in a Pandora's box. That somehow, because people think, well, separation of church and state means no influence of faith on the public square. Well, the founders and framers, that was the furthest thing from their mind. They were people, they weren't all Christians as we would think of contemporary evangelicals, but they were all operating in a theistic world. Even Thomas Jefferson, who cut out every supernatural occurrence in his version of the Bible, writes the Declaration of Independence that all men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. So you have sort of this very much this religious language mixed into the founding language, but they built into the Constitution after the Constitution's written. They come back and establish the Bill of Rights. And the first one is government can't establish any religion. And that doesn't mean favor a denomination. They can't even establish a secular religion. In other words, the government can't control your ideas or your speech. They can't put in place a national or state religion. Neither can they infringe upon the freedom of religious expression, and that extends to speech. So what we have to do is understand that religious freedom is a founding principle. They felt it was essential to a free society to express our religious beliefs freely.
Yeah.
And I think the other part of that then is that the reason that they did that, and this is so critical, I think, for us as Christians to realize, they didn't do it so that Christians would be protected. They did it because they believed it was good for a society. That without the presence of religious influence in a culture, that virtue, justice, morality, ethics, all those things have no basis on which to be built and nothing to which we can appeal to discuss those things, that it would be, I mean, they didn't talk about cultural relativism and subjectivism in their day, but the belief in religious influence in society was they felt it was not only necessary to preserve a free society and keep government out of it, but that it was actually good for the people of a country to have the free expression of religion. So when we start talking about religious liberty, it's not just being on the winning or losing side of a political issue or a law. We're actually talking about a founding principle. And I don't think that many people think about religious liberty as a founding principle, those things that are essential to the flourishing of a free society.
Yeah. And you know, in our Christian circles, you know, the term pluralism is a bad word. Because of what Christ has done for us and our desire to share the good news of Jesus Christ. And pluralism flies in the face of that. But yet this is actually a little bit of a positive side to pluralism when you look at our government context in which our founding fathers set up this new experiment,
right.
And in order for a culture to be thriving, and we have history to kind of look back on that. So talk a little bit about that too, of thousands of years of history of whenever religion was taken out of culture, society, what happens?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting. You know, we sometimes always get caught into thinking, well, we're the first ones to cross this river, this divide, this issue. We're the first ones to have to deal with this. The truth is that Christians from the advent of Christianity have wrestled with this relationship between the world and people of faith, Christianity and the world, Christianity and culture, Christianity and the state. You know, it's really sort of a phenomenal thing when you actually look at the relationship between, you know, Christianity and individual Christians, collectively Christians in the church and the world. And I think that one of the things that we see very early on is that the influence of Christians in society actually makes life better for everyone in society. And, you know, I might make the argument that that's not true of all religions. But I think that while, you know, Christianity gets a black eye on certain things historically where the narrative, you know, shows that there were problems. You have to remember, even going back, that Nero's burning Christians at the stake and then Constantine converts to Christianity, and everything changes in Rome. And so the reach of the gospel and the influence of Christianity, and by implication larger, religion, actually gives society mooring, gives it some belief that there's a higher moral authority to which we have to answer, and according to which our lives and society should be ordered. If you take that away, you end up with a really, subjectivist kind of view of the world. And I think historically, you're right. If you don't have to go you don't have to be a big reader, or you just do a search for some documentaries on 20th century communism, and you'll see, Lenin and Stalin get rid of the church. That it rids society of religious influence. That's the fastest way to oppress people. It's the fastest way to get people under control. It's the fastest way to extend, oppressive regimes, is eliminate religion. The Romans were doing the same thing. How could you let a religion thrive that told people they could be free from death? That's the only threat we have, is the threat of death is what keeps people in line. You're telling them they don't have to worry about death. That's the ultimate expression of freedom. And tyrants don't want that.
Yeah. And even like you mentioned communism or socialism or different ideological political approaches that deny God or the existence of God. That doesn't let them off the hook of not being a religion. It's a worldview. It's a structure. That's exactly right. And the danger of that, and that's what the forefathers were trying to protect against. Whatever religion or whatever ideology, the government can't be the one to say this is it and this is what you have to do.
Which is why the First Amendment doesn't stop at religion. It actually gets to the freedom of expression. So if you think about it, so you have people who say, well, you can't, just go back in our history, with creationism and Darwinism in public schools, and people say, we can't do creation because that's tied to religion. So they're doing Darwinism, which has all of the assertions and dogmas of a religion. It's a secular worldview that people must adhere to, that has tenets and doctrines. So it isn't just about religion. It's about the controlling of ideas and the expression of those ideas that the framers had in view. And I do think that's a problem. There is kind of a secular morality and a secular worldview that looks and smells and acts like a religion, but somehow that's okay. But when you label it that it's tied to faith, then it becomes problematic. Yeah,
and this has probably been the case. And again, it's the danger of living in your time and not recognizing, all of history. But there's a feeling or a sense that what we're experiencing today, no one else has experienced. But I think today what has happened, and we've intertwined politics with it, and politics and religion are commingled together. And I'm sure that's happened in the past too. But I think that's perhaps it's on steroids today.
I think if you think about it this way, and I've had this happen to me in just, I want to say in recent years, I could tell you in the last few days, even when you start actually talking about things like religious liberty and you begin to advocate for it. So even when we posted here that I was testifying before this group and what I shared, we had people criticizing, making comments online that we were Christian nationalists and, that we sort of were champions of the Republican Party and believed that Jesus was a Republican. I didn't talk about politics at all. We were talking about the principle of religious liberty. And so at the same time that you have this problem where you have this commingling of faith and religion with politics, and you also have a problem that Christians have, which is in any time we're talking about anything political, somehow that necessarily means that we've politicized it. And that's just not the case. The Apostle Paul invoked his rights as a Roman citizen, for the purpose of preaching the gospel. Jesus knew full well about the realm of Caesar when he interacted with people on whose face is on the coin. The idea somehow that Christians can't think about and talk about things that are of a political nature or principles of a society and how it should be run, that somehow doing that means we're necessarily political is somewhat problematic. I have people all the time say we can't criticize communism because that's a very American, ethnocentric, politically narrow. You can deal with communism as an ideology. Forget talking about it politically. There are ideological assumptions in that we should be thinking about, is it consistent with a Christian worldview and biblical teaching?
Yeah. And a society ought to be able to have the freedom in the public square to be able to have those conversations, because that's what the framers had in mind.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's what the framers had in mind. So you mentioned testifying, and I mentioned that at the top of the show. So let's switch gears and talk about your experiencing with so President Trump put together a Religious Liberty Commission. And so high level, talk to us about the experience and kind of what your takeaways were after testifying.
Yeah. This Religious Liberty Commission, I think, is a good thing. Yet to be seen what comes of it. But the president has put together this commission and asked them to make some recommendations regarding religious liberties. There are a lot of people of faith in and around this administration, in Congress right now, in a lot of government agencies. There is a lot of talk about religious liberty and the place of faith in society. And I think what this commission is looking for is to get information from a number of individuals about what are our struggles in various sectors with regard to religious liberty and the ways in which religious liberty is being stepped on or hindered or challenged, undermined, whatever it might be. And so we were invited to come in and speak to ways in which regulatory bodies, the government and accrediting bodies, might be overreaching into religious educational institutions and threatening the term we testified on was their religious identity and autonomy as a faith-based institution. I think that was our job. Now, this commission is dealing with lots of things: school choice. It's dealing with people of faith in public school settings, whether or not a football coach can pray after a game at a public high school, those kinds of things. Our task, the panel that I was on, was to talk about the issues that we're facing with the challenge to our religious identity and autonomy. And so the commission's comprised of a number of individuals, of different levels of notoriety, and they have already had several hearings. They have several more planned, and then they'll present to the administration their recommendations. They're technically operating under the Department of Justice, which is a very interesting thing to think about. It's not an independent thing that reports directly to the Oval Office. It's under the auspices of the Department of Justice, which is that government agency that's charged to protecting people's rights legally. And so we talked about, there were four of us, one rabbi representing Jewish schools, specifically from New York City, a priest from Michigan, where a school was being threatened by the state to be closed because it wasn't in line with public school curriculum, and then the attorney representing them. And then I was there representing Christian higher education, which was a real honor.
It sounds like the beginning of a joke, Todd.
Yeah, it is a little bit. You could say, rabbi, a priest, and a lawyer walk into a room, but it was great. And everybody had, I think, interesting things to say. And the commissioners asked a number of questions afterwards of us. What I tried to do in speaking for the Christian higher education sector, which includes us, ABHE schools. And I think also I tried to represent the larger group of Christian colleges across the country, particularly conservative ones that still uphold biblical authority, is to say that there are bodies that have overreached and threatened our religious identity and autonomy, despite the fact that we are Christian organizations ministering to a Christian constituency. In other words, our students want a biblical and theologically oriented education in a Christian community with a Christian worldview at the center of everything we do. That's what they're seeking. That's what they want. That's what they're paying for. And we still have certain bodies, professional accreditation bodies or government organizations that push us on with regard to our religious identity and autonomy. And so that's basically what I went there to talk about, and specifically citing our experience at Cairn University with the Council for Social Work Education and KCREP. We had some issues with the Department of Education, but those got tabled. But we've had some recent experiences here where both those organizations, I think, have overreached in telling us what we can and cannot teach regarding values, ideology, our faith, our convictions.
Yep.
And that, so I shared a little bit of that story with them.
Yeah. And your testimony is actually available publicly, correct? I mean,
sure. The Religious Liberty Commission on YouTube. You can find that day and our panels about halfway through the day.
Yep. And we'll put a link to that in the show description. Sure. One of the things that people forget in this conversation, which I think is it's a nuance that's, you can gloss over it, but I think it's a fundamental piece to why higher education, particularly private higher education, more specifically Christian higher education, ought to be left alone in the sense of being able to teach according to their convictions. And that is because higher education is not compulsory. It is not required. K-12 education, I think, it's a little bit more complicated because it is something that is, or at least 1st to 12th grade is something that is required. But higher education is not. The market votes by their feet. They are looking for something and paying for something, a service, an experience that they know full well what they're getting into.
Right. And I think that is too often overlooked. And actually the argument that we should be making, even more clearly, apart from the legal things that we get drawn into and the litigation that sometimes comes about and are leaning on places like organizations like ADF to help us through that, is we should be out there making this case. And I think it's a very good point, which is this is not compulsory. I'm not forcing I do have standards at a place like Cairn University that compels students to attend chapel, carry out Christian ministry, attend certain classes, but they chose to come here and knowing who we were. One of the things that's interesting, I just thought about this now when you said that, is one of the things we lose sight of is we get somewhat tunnel vision. We think religious liberty. Religious liberty is tied to the other founding principle of individual liberties, which is I have individual rights and freedoms to make choices for myself. And that's expressed also in free markets and private ownership of property, which is people should be free to choose what kind of education they want. So my argument on Title IV isn't, if you take our money, if you take federal money from our students, they won't be able to afford college. My thing is, if you give it to one, you have to give it to the other, and you have to let them be free to choose what kind of education they want to spend that money on. Yeah. And to not allow them to choose a religious organization, a faith-based organization, a Christian organization at which to study is discriminatory, in terms of their freedom to make those choices. So religious liberty is tied to those other founding principles, which include, there are other things, but include individual liberty and private property and free markets. Like, we get to choose, and our people are choosing that. We shouldn't lose sight of that.
Yeah. And they're choosing an education to prepare them for a life's trajectory of occupation, of ministry, or whatever else. And where it gets complicated and where the rub now comes in is when we are trying to deliver to the people who are choosing to be at our institutions appropriate education. You cannot separate worldview and theology and ideology from how we approach the occupations that we do. Think counseling, think all of the social sector positions, ministry. You're working with people, and now the rub comes in when you have external bodies who are coming into those contexts and enforcing or forcing an ideology that then is that is directly contrary, and that now becomes what we're talking about with religious liberty.
Yeah, and I think that that's a very important thing for us to be vigilant. I would think, many of your listeners here are in some way tied to this work of Christian education, or thinking about education Christianly, at least, whether as people in the work or sending kids there or supporting the work financially, serving on boards, is that we need to actually remember that aspect of it, that there is no such thing as a values neutral education. Yeah. And so what happens is we get this criticism. Well, you're religious. What you really mean is you don't agree with our position on certain things, not just things like human sexuality or the sanctity of life, but also a belief in a higher moral authority that governs the way we should think and live. People reject that. But when you actually are talking about indoctrinating students in another setting that says there is no moral authority, you're free to do whatever you want, that is a tenet. That's a belief that you're purporting. And actually, we get accused all the time in Christian higher education by those who would oppose us to say we're indoctrinating students. And my response is always, you are too. I went to a public university for graduate school. Don't tell me there's no indoctrination there. Yeah. These are the things that all reasonable people believe, and anybody who doesn't believe is unintelligent or unreasonable.
Yeah.
And that's
which gets back then to full circle, the primer at the top, where we said, what the strength of what the forefathers put together was a culture and society that allowed for the free exchange of those ideas. So let the people vote with their feet if they want an education from a particular worldview, whether it's an evangelical Christian worldview or a secular, those are all worldviews. Let them choose, because in the end, it makes our whole culture and society that much better.
And those founding principles, just real quick, include self-governance, and that's exactly what it is. We live in a society. Not every society gives people that freedom to choose. If you were a Christian in Maoist China, like you didn't. I mean, you couldn't even choose what clothes you were wearing, let alone, the free expression of religion. That's where God in his providence, you're in that particular cultural context. But we happen to be in a context where those freedoms exist. And the framers believed it was good for the world, good for humanity, good for societies to have those things. And we should let those things run their course. People should be free to choose.
Yeah. I want to zero in, bring it a little bit closer to our sector. And I'm gonna go right to a question which I think you have identified. So a lot of there are so many external pressures that are a lot of this is existential. So much of it is outside of our control, and colleges and Christian colleges and universities are put in reactive mode. But yet there are things that our institutions do that actually work against protecting religious liberty in the greater context of our sector. And I make the argument it's almost dangerous to the point that when we're trying to legally protect religious liberty, there are some choices that some colleges and universities make, knowingly or unknowingly, that actually hurt some of our legal arguments as a sector to be able to be free to exercise according to our belief systems and structures. So you have three of them, which I think is just so powerful. So walk us through those three.
Sure. I think, and I've tried to spend some time thinking on this. Okay, it's one thing for, I enjoy this particular world of politics and history, but not everybody does. So I say, well, I'm not really bent that way, so I don't really have to think about it. But all of us in our work in Christian education, I think, have to recognize that we've been placed in a particular context to carry out work. And I said this, let me precede this by saying, I said this, you were in the room when I said this the other day. It'd be a mistake for us theologically to say, as Christians, we should be fighting for religious liberties, because if we don't, the gospel won't spread. That's a ridiculous statement. Christians have preached the gospel from prison. That's how Christianity spread, was under the threat of persecution. The issue is that, so the ones that we appear to be fighting against with regard to religious liberties are the ones that we're actually fighting for. This is good for everyone to have religious liberty. That said, then what we need to do is take seriously our role as educators to educate our students regarding life in the land where God has placed them. If they're going to seek the welfare of the city in which God has placed them, as the children of Israel were told by the prophet in exile, then we should actually provide some means of doing that. And I think one of the most practical ways to do it is to teach your students civics. That doesn't mean simply history or politics. Civics. What is the structure and function of government? What does the Constitution say? What are their rights? What are not the rights given to them by government, but the protection of the God-given rights that we have? How does the executive branch function? You have Christians disagreeing on politics all over the place. They're making these outrageous statements, and you think they don't know anything about how the government works. I mean, I talk to people all the time. I don't know where they think the government gets their money, but they don't know much about taxes. I think they think DC holds a bake sale every 6 weeks to pay for things. I mean, it's the citizens' money that funds the government. Just think about that for a minute. So I think our institutions would do well to teach a civics and government class so that our students and our faculty, the ethos of our organizations, is informed. It doesn't necessarily mean you're politicizing your campus. You're trying to make sure that your students and people can be good stewards of the rights that are protected in the current context in which they find them. So I think that's
so the first one. So stated in the negative, what are the things that we do that hurt us? We don't require.
We don't teach civics. We don't teach civics. We might say, well, we'll have these things, and there are lots of things we choose to teach and not this. And I think that's a problem. We don't teach civics, and that is going to make us weaker. One, in defending religious liberty, and two, in having a positive role in a way that's good for everyone in society. The second thing I think that we do is we have to be very cautious regarding open enrollment. We don't actually protect Christian covenant and Christian community. There are lots of reasons that schools do that, but it's really problematic to claim you serve a Christian constituency that wants a Christian education, that believes in biblical authority. So you outside bodies that are trying to infringe upon our religious identity and autonomy, in a sense, our religious liberties, you have to hold at bay because these are our people, when in fact our schools are not serving our people. And I think that that's a pretty serious problem, to state it in the negative, not guarding Christian community. The learning that takes place in Christian community, we all talk about it philosophically. This is what we do: Christian community, chapel, discipleship, integration, service projects, ministry, mission trips, all of that. When you actually are not protecting that covenant community, you're actually, I think, going to make it harder with regard to religious liberty.
Yeah.
And the third one is,
and I'll just pause you. That is so true. There was a legal term that was set up, I think it was in the 1970s, with some of the cases. It was kind of a test, and the words that they used were a pervasively religious institution. Right. Like, what defines a pervasively religious institution? And some of the markers were things like required chapel services, a Bible in the curriculum, and a Christian service component. Like that's how they defined it. But all of that assumes the students are choosing to be there because they are Christ followers. And we have to be careful, because there are some institutions who have a very good, legitimate approach to open enrollment and the opportunity to share Christ. The point is that we're making, fine, but know the decision that you've made has consequences.
That's exactly right.
Potential legal arguments to protect Title IX exemption, that perhaps you're not so pervasively religious as you think you are.
I think
if you're allowing everybody in.
That's the point. There might be good discussion to have for and against that approach. And what the implications are. And we all know that even with the covenant obligation, we have kids coming into our institutions who don't really know Jesus. That's fine. The issue is when you're actually undermining your identity as a religious institution because you're not actually serving that population. That's a problem.
So third thing.
What's that?
Third thing? The
third thing, I think, is the issue of faculty, and I would say staff fidelity to mission and conviction. If we're gonna actually have people working in our ranks who do not hold our convictions, or we're going to allow people who were with us at one time who drifted to remain either out of Christian charity or necessity, or because we don't have a mechanism for making those changes, we're going to undermine this as well. There are all kinds of consequences to the fulfillment of your mission in not maintaining faculty and staff fidelity. But as we're talking about this religious liberty issue, it's a pretty serious problem, because you find yourself saying, no, we want to maintain the right to argue for biblical authority in all expressions regarding human life and experience. That is, we want the Bible to speak authoritatively to human sexuality and gender. And then you have faculty members who are saying, I don't really agree with that. And you say, well, how much are you really committed to it if you're letting people teach sociology, history, philosophy, or religion courses who don't actually agree with you? Well, we really agree. Well, obviously not enough to ensure that it's actually taught that way in every classroom. So I do think we have to, there are philosophical and pedagogical and theological reasons to defend that ground, in my view, for the benefit of our students. But I do think when we're talking specifically about this issue of religious liberty and religious expression, it opens us up to the question of how fully we hold these convictions, and almost how hypocritical we are that we say we believe this and everybody must believe it, but we tolerate deviance from it. in our ranks. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah. Good. Great. So Todd, we're at the end. We have a minute left. So hopefully those of you who have been listening in, you've been challenged to kind of think through this. And many of our folks are leaders in Christian colleges and Bible colleges. What's one practical steps, our list? Maybe stuff that we talked about today, maybe conviction of how they approach things or challenge of how they approach things. What's one practical step our listeners can take towards religious liberty?
So I think the first thing would be to actually read something, listen to something that talks to it, get exposed to these ideas about founding principles. Talk about it. Like listen, read, talk about it. Get on ADF's site and look at what they say about it. Get to these other, start to figure out what was going on. I'm honestly, read the Constitution, for crying out loud. It doesn't take that long to do. Read how much religious language is in the Declaration of Independence. Get a sense of how important this is to the functioning of a free society, and have those conversations. And don't allow your exposure, your reading, or your conversations to get squelched by people saying, well, politics is divisive, we shouldn't talk about it. We're not talking about politics. We're talking about founding principles and what makes a society thrive.
Yeah. Todd, I really appreciate your time over the last 30 minutes. Appreciate you even taking the opportunity to go and testify before that commission. Your press is there, everybody's there, so everyone's measuring your words, and you did a phenomenal job. I think you represented biblical and Christian higher education exceptionally well. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here. I enjoy talking with you always. So.
Absolutely. And we'll put a couple in the show description. We'll put a link to the testimony so you can see that, as well as information about Todd and his work at Cairn University. So until next time, stay kingdom focused.
The Biblical Higher Ed Talk podcast is proud to be a part of the Higher Ed Marketer Podcast Network. Discover even more conversations, resources, and tools to help you grow your institution at thehigheredmarketer.com, your go-to community for all things higher ed marketing and leadership.